Navigating by Nose, Part 1. After my family moved from Gosport to Fareham, my brother and I had a vast new territory to explore. The housing estate on the edge of town bordered open fields where there were ponds, thickets, meadows and streams. One of our discoveries was the Gillies, a strangely named stream that flowed through our new precinct, bordered by dense willow groves. Its bed was the same clay from which our garden was made. Brown, thick, sticky when dry, but wet, greasy and very slippery. There was never any doubt in our mother's mind where we'd been when we came home covered in clay. The little river flowed in a surprisingly deep valley to Howford, the first major change in the landscape between Fareham and Gosport, and it empties into Fareham Creek, or as it's now known, Howford Lake. All the many creeks entering Portsmouth Harbour have been promoted to lake status in the last 70 years. No doubt because of the woodland through which it flowed, the Gillies always smelt of rotting leaves, like a compost heap. The inland end of Fareham Creek and the limit of navigable water is a mile or so further south at Wallington. Fishing is still possible further upstream in the little River Wallington that rises on Portsdown Hill. But like so many watercourses, it has been hit by stormwater discharges in recent years. At the time I'm describing, the headwaters of the creek at Saltons had the dubious benefit of one of the several sewage farms, or as they're now called, water processing plants, that emptied into Portsmouth Harbour. In the book The Wind in the Willows, the water rat describes the upper reaches of his river as smelling like plum cake in summer when the water is low. Fareham Creek smelt not at all like plum cake, but fruity all the same. Twice a day in the summer, when the tide was low, the mud banks were exposed, greenish-brown and gloopy. As a teenager, I was the grandly titled moorings officer for the Fareham Sea Scout group. The moorings for our new whaleboat were to be opposite our headquarters at the town quay. I had U-shaped iron bars set in two 40-gallon oil drums filled with concrete. We secured them to a timber across our dinghy on the slipway at low tide, and then let the morning tide lift them under the dinghy. As the tide rose, we planned to paddle across the creek to our mooring point, carefully triangulated with compass bearings. Then we would let the oil drums go to sink into the soft mud under their own weight. All we had to do then was pick up our mooring chains, attach the floating buoys, and go home. It was a beautiful day of cloudless skies with sunshine and spring tides, which are the highest and lowest tides of the lunar month, all the year round, not just in spring. 3 of us assembled after breakfast, and everything went well, apart from, firstly, I had miscalculated the depth of water, so we had to drag the 50-kilo oil drums the last few metres to the mooring point as the tide ebbs. One of the laws of physics that was brought home to me is about equal and opposite forces. 50 kilos is the weight of a full sack of coal or cement, so lifting it up pushes you down with 50 kilos of force. But we staggered on through glutinous greenish-brown mud up to our thighs. The top layers were the consistency of blancmange, but the deeper mud was also full of nameless bits, some sharp, some spiky, some stony. It bubbled lazily, smelly and slow. Within minutes, the 3 of us in the inside and the outside of the dinghy were covered in mud. We looked like the mudlarks at Portsmouth Harbour Station, but unlike them, there was no one to throw coins we could scrabble for. And it turned out the oil drums weren't heavy enough to sink to the required depth, so they had to be dug in. And as we dug, liquid mud flowed back into the holes, which had to be dredged out with a bucket as fast as the mud slid into them. In spite of the setbacks, by low tide the job was done, the oil drums were sunk, their buoys were attached and ready to float as the tide rose. But it was 2 more hours before the incoming tide was high enough to refloat our dinghy, and by then we'd been in direct sun for 4 hours. The sulphurous smell of the mud came out of our skin for days and killed any romantic plans, a severe blow for 16-year-olds. With hindsight, the mooring project was amazingly dangerous. With no one around, we might have drowned in the mud or the rising tide. We had no sun or skin protection, except, of course, the mud itself. We should probably have been vaccinated against half a dozen diseases. Although you can overdo health and safety, I had at least learned to think through a plan and investigate, rather than assuming everything will be how it looks. After the ordeal by mud, I didn't give up boating. I just did more as opportunities arose, but always tried to stay in the boat and out of the mud. Sailing east or west, the wind was always against you in the stretch of the creek from Saltons, known as Heavy Reach, where the sewage farm fed into the harbour. It processed sewage in the most basic fashion, and the effluent was disgusting, especially in a hot summer. The water here was always brown. It often had froth inches deep on the surface that smelt strongly, not of sewage, strangely enough, but of mildew and fungus, which encouraged you to keep your mouth shut when tacking across the waterway. But even in dense fog or snow, both of which seemed more common 60 years ago, you knew it by the distinctive pong. There were mysterious items that floated around near the sewage farm, sometimes singly, sometimes in shoals, especially at weekends. These unmentionable rubber items were a source of fascination and endless sniggering to us teenagers. Heading further south into Portsmouth Harbour, the deep water channel between the armament depots at Bednam and Freighter was full of ships. Redundant frigates, destroyers, even an aircraft carrier and a battleship. They were festooned with War Ministry keep-off notices. Braver boys than me landed on them and explored their decks and their depths, the silent guns and the torpedo tubes. Known as the Mothball Fleet, they were waiting to be towed away to be scrapped. Perhaps the most notable was the towing of HMS Vanguard. This famous battleship evidently did not want to be scrapped. At the harbour mouth it ran away from its tug and went aground on Portsmouth Point by the Still and West pub, which has pictures of the event in the bar. I have the pictures in my head because schoolboys like me came from miles around to Gorp. The Mothball Fleet had its own smells, strange, sticky, gunky, anti-corrosion tape in which the machinery was wrapped, along with steel, oil, diesel, grease and paint. People sometimes find it strange to talk about the smell of steel. It's the iron that smells, of course. If you've had a nosebleed, you may have smelt the iron in your own blood. The fleet made a major contribution to the pollution of the harbour, which had a permanent oil slick and brownish grey water. Until it didn't, but that came later. There were rumours about what would happen to you if you swallowed the harbour water, though when I was learning to sail, I spent as much time in the harbour as on it, apparently without ill effects. Continuing down the harbour, I'm taking a small digression, turning north for a short distance. Porchester had the dubious benefit of the so-called hoof and horn factory, a rendering plant that took the unwanted and inedible parts of animals and turned them into glue, gelatin, tallow, bone meal, animal feed, and I don't know what. The prevailing westerly winds usually carried much of the grim smell towards Cosham and Havant, with understandable resentment from residents and demands for the factory to be shut down. Easterly winds mostly occurred in winter, so with closed windows there was less nuisance in Fareham and Gosport, but there was no escaping the malodor. This was a pity because Porchester and its adjoining creek was then, as it is now, one of the more picturesque parts of the harbour. Then there was Bombketch Creek. Its name tells you that it had been used in the 19th century for mooring the ferocious little warships that carried great mortars and could cause devastation to much bigger vessels by raining huge projectiles down on their decks. Plunging fire, it was called. It had also been used as a firing range for gunnery practice, perhaps for hundreds of years. This came to light when, for unknown reasons, the mud started to erode. As the layers were washed away, there would appear all sorts of shells, bullets, cannonballs, mortar bombs, grape shot canisters, bar shot, modern and ancient. We took our Sea Scout boats to the creek and collected as much of the hardware as we could, selling it to scrap and antique dealers to raise funds for our scout group. The solid iron cannonballs and the shells, also spherical, also iron, but hollow so they could be packed with explosive, that had been in the mud for ages past, had changed their composition. I mentioned the sulphurous smell from the mud. Well, the sulphur interacted with the iron and converted it to iron sulphide. This became a problem when we'd sold quite a lot of this ironmongery because it had a distinctive chemical smell which becomes unpleasant in a confined space. Some people thought a cannonball on the fireplace would be rather attractive. When the smell became intolerable, the shop was put out in the garden. Exposed to air and rain, they disintegrated into a pile of smelly rust. Nowadays, I imagine we would be imprisoned for theft and health and safety breaches. Then no one even asked for their money back. Moving closer to the harbour mouth, the tide swilled the area twice a day, and it smelled much more like the Solent itself. People often think they can smell ozone at the seaside, though it's probably the seaweed as it grows, dies and decomposes. The currents in the harbour entrance run fiercely, not surprising when so many cubic kilometres of water are forcing their way in or out through an entrance only 200 metres wide. At full bore, you can hardly sail against them even in a strong wind, and you definitely can't row against them, a fact I established by many futile experiments in the Sea Scout whaleboat. I spent my last summer at school working as a deckhand on the Portsmouth to Isle of Wight ferries. If you did okay on the diesel-fueled propeller-driven ferry, you had a chance of spending time on the last remaining paddle-driven ferry, powered by steam, created by coal. These smelt like the mothball fleet, but with the addition of coal, smoke and soot. Every morning we took on several tons of coal for the day's sailings, which came on board in sacks and had to be tipped into the coal hole. Inevitably, the dust made a terrible mess that had to be cleaned up with shovels, brooms and hoses before the day trippers came on board in their nice summer clothes. The engineers were the on-board aristocracy who wore white boiler suits and read the Times underneath the whirling, nodding, dodging, connecting rods, slides and travellers, occasionally oiling some gleaming metalwork. But the heart of the ship was the canteen, smelling warmly delicious and run by Cussin Lil. After coaling, you went down with your breakfast in a paper bag. An egg, a ration of bacon, a slice of bread, a tomato, a sausage perhaps, and diffidently asked Lil if she would cook it for you. "You effing little bleeder," she would shout. "Do you think I ain't got nothing better to do than cook your effing breakfast?" "Sorry, Lil," you'd mumble. "Give it here, you useless little effer," she would bellow, and snatch it from your hand, returning it on a plate perfectly cooked 5 minutes later. I can smell the bacon as I write. Once outside the harbour, the water seemed cleaner and greener, lapping the shingle beaches of Stokes Bay and Southsea. Those beaches had distinctive smells too. Until the 1980s, beaches were composed of pebbles, sand, crabs, dead fish, and something we called beach tar, black globules that stuck to your hands, feet, or shoes. It was the result of oil tankers washing out their tanks on the approaches to the coast. It was so pernicious that an essential item in the picnic basket was a bottle of turpentine or white spirit to get it off your clothes or skin, adding a different smell. But from the 1980s, the international conventions on marine pollution began to take effect, and now, unless there's an accident or an oil spill, beach tar hardly exists. I began to sail offshore in yachts. They have distinctive smells, especially in rough weather when the hatches have to be closed. This was the era when everyone, except me it seemed, smoked. You can imagine the smell of a yacht's cabin after a night in a gale. Wet socks, sweaty bodies, stale smoke, vomit, Irish stew and cheese. There always seemed to be cheese. Visualise the huge relief of getting out on deck, even when waves were breaking over everything. Perhaps the most unexpected aromas came approaching the coast of another country, often before you could see it. From 10 kilometres away, France smelt of those special brands of cigarettes, Gauloise and Gitane, and what was then an unfamiliar odour, garlic. From a similar distance, the Netherlands smelt of the Swedish pipe tobacco that was everywhere. I imagined the continental nose. England smelt of woodbines and capstan untipped. I didn't visit the harbour for perhaps 15 years after I first left home, but when I returned I was astonished. No mothball fleet, no oil slick, no brown froth, not a hint of sewage. Instead, clear green water with fish and huge flocks of seagulls, cormorants, terns, and heron diving for their dinner. Now nature is red in beak and claw, tooth and fin. Vast shoals of small fry come in on the tide and are eaten by their larger relatives, which are pursued by the biggest predators, fishermen, and occasionally by the harbour seal.